A free man walks into a room. He sits down across from a lanista, a gladiator trainer, a businessman, a man who buys and sells human beings for a living. On the table between them is a single document. A few lines of Latin text. A wax seal. A place for a name. The free man picks up the stylus. He signs, and in that single moment, in the time it takes to scratch his name into wax, he ceases to be a person under Roman law. He becomes property, not a slave. Something stranger than a slave. Something Rome invented specifically for this purpose. A free man who had legally chosen to surrender every right a free man possessed. The right to his own body. The right to refuse an order. The right to decide whether he lived or died. He signed all of that away, voluntarily for money. How does a civilization that produced Seneca and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius and men who wrote endlessly about human dignity and the sacred nature of freedom, how does that same civilization create a legal document that allows a free person to sell himself into something worse than slavery? And why? This is the question that keeps historians up at night. Why did thousands of people sign it? This is the story of the Octoramentum. Rome's most dangerous contract. The legal fine print that turned free citizens into arena property. And the human beings who lived and died inside its terms. To understand the Octoramentum, you first need to understand what Rome actually was, not the Rome of movies. Not the gleaming white marble and heroic speeches Rome that has been sold to you since school. The real Rome. The crowded, violent, economically brutal, socially rigid Rome that most of its inhabitants actually experienced. Rome at its height had a population of somewhere between 1 and 2 million people crammed into the city of Rome alone. The majority of them were poor. Not struggling to save money poor. Genuinely, existentially, one bad week away from starvation poor. The apartment buildings they lived in, called insulae, were 6, 7, 8 stories tall, built of cheap materials, frequently on fire, perpetually overcrowded. Rent was extortionate. Food was expensive. Work was irregular, underpaid, and humiliating. Below the free poor were the slaves, and Rome had between 2 and 4 million of them in Italy alone. Between 30 and 40% of the entire population. People who had no legal existence whatsoever. Who were worked to death in mines and fields and kitchens and workshops. Whose children were born into bondage. Who had no recourse, no rights, no protection except the economic self-interest of the people who owned them. This was the world into which the Octoramentum was born. And in that world, where a free man could watch an enslaved person fight in the arena and think, with genuine envy, that the gladiator ate better than he did, the contract made a terrible kind of sense. Let us start with what the Octoramentum actually was. The word comes from octorare, to bind oneself, to obligate oneself, to commit. It was a formal legal contract between a free person and a lanista, the owner and trainer of a gladiatorial school, called a ludus. And it was binding in ways that most modern people find difficult to comprehend. When you signed the Octoramentum, you were not just agreeing to fight. You were agreeing to submit to the complete authority of the lanista in 4 specific and terrifying ways. These 4 conditions were not buried in fine print. They were stated openly, explicitly, as the core terms of the agreement. They were so well known in Roman society that the satirist Petronius, writing in the 1st century AD, could reference them casually as shorthand for total self-surrender. The 4 terms were iuri, vinciri, verberari, feroce necari. To be burned. To be bound. To be beaten. To be killed by iron. That was the contract. You agreed, in writing, before witnesses, under Roman law, to accept being burned, chained, flogged, and killed. At the discretion of your lanista. Without legal recourse. Without the right to protest or refuse. You signed up for that. Voluntarily. The Roman legal system, which was in many ways extraordinarily sophisticated, which produced frameworks for property law and contract law and civil procedure that form the foundation of legal systems in use today, looked at a document in which a free person agreed to be burned and beaten and killed, and called it an enforceable contract. Because the person signing it was free. And because they were free, their consent was considered valid. The philosophical and moral contradiction at the heart of this, that a legal system built on the concept of free consent could use that same concept to permanently extinguish freedom, was not lost on Roman thinkers. They wrote about it. They argued about it. Cicero was deeply uncomfortable with the entire institution. But the games were popular. The Lanistae were wealthy and politically connected. And the Roman state had a vested interest in keeping the arena running. So the contract stood. Now let us walk through what signing actually looked like. Because the ceremony of it matters. The Romans understood the psychology of ritual. They knew that making a commitment visible and formal in public changed how a person experienced that commitment. The signing of the auctoramentum was not a quiet administrative procedure. It was a declaration. A crossing of a threshold. A death of one identity and the birth of another. A prospective gladiator, called a tyro, a novice, would come to the ludus. Sometimes he came alone, having sought out the lanista himself. Sometimes he was brought by a recruiter, a middleman who worked the poor neighborhoods of Roman cities looking for young men who were desperate enough, strong enough, and sufficiently disconnected from other options. The lanista would assess him. This was not sentimental. It was commercial. He was looking at a potential investment. The cost of training a gladiator from scratch, housing him, feeding him, equipping him, paying the physicians who kept him alive, paying the instructors who taught him to fight, was substantial. A lanista who trained fighters who died quickly in their first or second bout was a lanista who was losing money. So the assessment was thorough. Age ideally between 17 and 25. Physical condition, muscle mass, existing injuries, potential for development. Temperament, not reckless courage, which got fighters killed early, but controlled aggression, the ability to take pain without panicking, the capacity to learn and follow instruction. If the lanista was satisfied, terms were discussed. And here is where it gets complicated. Because the auctoramentum was not a single standard document. It was negotiated. Different fighters signed different terms. Some signed for a fixed number of fights. Some for a fixed period of years. Some for their entire lives. Some received an upfront signing payment, called an auctoramentum fee, that could be substantial. Others received only the promise of food, housing, and medical care. The range was enormous. At the low end, a desperate young man from the slums might sign away 5 years of his life for a sum of money that seems, by any reasonable measure, inadequate to the risk involved. At the high end, an experienced fighter with a reputation might negotiate terms that gave him considerable control over the number and type of bouts he accepted. But regardless of the specific terms, the four foundational conditions were always present. Uri, vinciri, verberari, feroce necari. To be burned, bound, beaten, killed. No negotiation removed those words. They were the bedrock of the contract. And once the stylus was lifted from the wax, they were permanent. The moment you signed the auctoramentum, several things happened simultaneously under Roman law. Your social status changed. You became infamous in the precise legal sense of that word. Not famous in the modern sense. Infamous in the Roman legal sense meant stripped of certain civil rights. You could no longer serve in certain public offices. You could not bring certain legal actions. You were placed in the same legal category as prostitutes, actors, and executioners, people whose bodies were available for public use and whose dignity was therefore, in Rome's brutal social calculus, forfeit. This was not a side effect of the contract. It was a deliberate feature of the Roman legal system. The infamia attached to gladiators served a specific social purpose. It created a clear, hard boundary between arena fighters and the rest of Roman society. It prevented gladiators, no matter how famous they became, from using their celebrity to accumulate social or political power. You could be the most celebrated fighter in Rome. Women could throw jewelry into the arena when you walked out. Your name could be written on the walls of Pompeii, and gladiators' names were written on the walls of Pompeii, scratched there by fans, the way people write athletes' names today. You could be recognizable to every person in a city of 1 million people. And you still could not vote in certain assemblies. You still could not testify in certain courts. You were infamous, legally diminished, permanently marked. Rome was very good at giving people glory while simultaneously reminding them of their place. The ludus itself, the gladiatorial school where you would now spend your life, was not a barracks. It was not a prison, though it could feel like one. It was a highly organized, carefully managed institution that represented a significant financial investment and was run accordingly. The largest and most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, located directly adjacent to the Colosseum. Built by the Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century AD and expanded by Trajan in the early 2nd century, it could house over 1,000 gladiators. It had its own training arena, a smaller oval practice space that is still partially visible today in excavations beside the Colosseum. It had barracks, kitchens, medical facilities, administrative offices, armories. It was connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel so that fighters could move from their barracks to the arena floor without ever appearing on the streets of Rome. The spectacle of gladiators walking through the city to fight was considered, by the state, by the Lanisti, a security and logistics problem more than anything else. The tunnel solved it. You went in one end as a person. You came out the other end as a performance. The daily routine inside the ludus was rigid, deliberately so. Not cruel rigidity, the Lanista had every financial incentive to keep his fighters in good condition, but the kind of rigidity that shapes human beings. That strips away individuality and replaces it with function. You woke before dawn. You trained. You ate. You trained again. You rested. You trained again. You slept. Every day. 4 months. 4 years. The training was not simply physical conditioning, though physical conditioning was a constant and demanding component. You were trained in specific fighting styles. Because the gladiatorial system Rome developed was not a simple cage match where 2 men fought until one died. It was a highly codified performance system with distinct fighter types, each with specific weapons, specific armor, specific fighting techniques, and specific opponents they were expected to face. Let us talk about the fighter types. Because this is where the contract becomes almost incomprehensibly specific. When a tyro signed the Octoramentum, one of the things that was determined either immediately or shortly after was which type of gladiator he would become. This was not entirely his choice. The Lanista made the decision based on physical assessment, temperament, and the current demand in the arena market. And the type you were assigned determined everything about your life from that moment forward. The Murmillo was heavily armed, a large rectangular shield called a scutum, a short sword called a gladius, a helmet with a distinctive fish crest decoration. He was a defensive fighter, trained to use his shield as both protection and weapon, to absorb aggression and wait for openings. The Thraex, the Thracian, carried a curved sword called a sicca and a small square shield. He was trained for aggressive, mobile combat. Faster than the Murmillo but more exposed. He relied on speed and the ability to get inside his opponent's defense. The Retiarius was perhaps the most visually distinctive fighter in the Roman arena. He carried no shield. His only armor was a metal shoulder guard on his left arm. His weapons were a trident, a dagger, and a net, a large weighted net that he used to entangle his opponent before finishing them. He was essentially unarmored, fighting heavily armored opponents with nothing but agility and the reach advantage his trident provided. The Secutor, the pursuer, was designed specifically to fight the Retiarius. His helmet was smooth and rounded, without the ridges and crests of other helmets, specifically so the Retiarius's net could not catch on it. His eye holes were tiny, small enough to keep the trident out, which meant his vision was severely limited. He could barely see. He wore heavy armor because the Retiarius needed to be prevented from using speed to stay away from him. He was designed to close distance fast, absorb punishment, and overwhelm. Every pairing in the arena was deliberate. Armored versus mobile. Speed versus strength. Reach versus power. The Roman audience, which was sophisticated and knowledgeable about gladiatorial combat in the way that modern audiences are knowledgeable about professional sports, understood these matchups intimately. They had preferences. They had favorites. They bet on outcomes. And the fighters themselves became specialists. A Retiarius did not know how to fight like a Murmillo. A Thraex was not trained in the techniques of a Secutor. You were your type. Your type was your identity. Your training, your weapons, your fighting style, your role in the spectacle, all of it was determined by the Lanista's initial assessment and locked in by the Octoromentum. You did not choose your weapon. Your weapon chose you. Now let us talk about the food. Because it tells you something important. Gladiators were called horderii by the Roman public. The word means barley men. Barley eaters. Their diet was primarily grain, barley, wheat, legumes, beans. Large quantities of it. Supplemented by ash drinks that historians believe were designed to increase calcium absorption and bone density. Possibly also vinegar drinks similar to the pasca that Roman soldiers drank. This diet sounds unimpressive. And by Roman elite standards it was. The wealthy Romans who watched gladiators fight ate meat, fish, garum sauce, vegetables, fruit, wine. The gladiator's diet was the diet of the poor and the agricultural laborer. But here is what that diet produced. Modern analysis of gladiatorial skeletal remains, and we have substantial gladiatorial cemetery evidence from sites like Ephesus in modern Turkey, where over 60 gladiatorial skeletons were discovered and extensively analyzed, shows that gladiators had significantly higher bone density than the average Roman population. They were not lean. They were not the shredded, muscle-defined fighters of movie depictions. They were stocky, heavy, padded with a layer of fat over their muscles that served a specific purpose. It protected the underlying muscle and the vital organs beneath it from the surface cuts and slashes that were the most common injuries in arena combat. A surface cut on a heavily built fighter bleeds dramatically. It looks spectacular to an audience. It demonstrates fighting quality and produces the visual excitement that the games required. But it does not kill quickly. It does not disable immediately. The Lanista did not want his fighters dying from every surface wound. Dead fighters were expensive investments that needed to be replaced. Injured fighters that healed and fought again were the economic model. The diet, the training, the body composition, all of it was engineered to produce fighters who could absorb punishment, survive it, and return to fight again. The body of a gladiator was not shaped by personal ambition or aesthetic preference. It was shaped by commercial calculation. You were a product. Your body was the product. And the Lanista managed the product with the cold precision of an investor protecting an asset. The medical care in a top-tier ludus was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkable. We know this in part because of a man named Galen. Galen of Pergamon is one of the most important figures in the history of medicine. His medical writings, compiled over a career of extraordinary productivity, formed the foundation of European and Islamic medical thinking for over 1,000 years. He was, in the 2nd century AD, the most sophisticated physician alive. And for several years early in his career, before he moved to Rome and eventually became personal physician to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, Galen worked as a physician to the gladiators of Pergamon. He wrote about this experience. What he observed and learned from treating gladiatorial injuries informed his understanding of anatomy in ways that would have been impossible to acquire elsewhere. Because treating gladiatorial injuries meant treating wounds that exposed the interior of the human body in ways that peacetime medicine rarely did. Galen called gladiatorial wounds windows into the body. He developed techniques for treating muscle damage, bone fractures, and deep wounds that were significantly more advanced than anything contemporary Roman medicine could otherwise have produced. He understood infection not in the modern microbiological sense, but in the practical observational sense that certain wounds treated in certain ways killed patients and the same wounds treated differently did not. The gladiators of Pergamon had access to this man's skills. Every day. As part of their contract. This is not a small thing. In a world where a simple infected wound could and regularly did kill people, having access to the most sophisticated physician of your era was a genuine survival advantage. The Lanista paid for Galen not out of compassion. He paid for him because a dead gladiator was a financial loss and a healed gladiator was a financial asset. The economics of the ludus required that injured fighters be returned to fighting condition as quickly and as completely as possible. But the result, whatever the motivation, was that the gladiators of a well-run ludus received better medical care than almost anyone else in Rome except the extremely wealthy. They signed away their freedom. They got in return food, housing, training, and the best doctor in the world. For a free man starving in an insula apartment with no prospects and no safety net, the calculation was not as obviously insane as it looks from the outside. Let us talk about what fighting actually looked like. Because the reality of the arena is substantially different from both the Hollywood version and the popular imagination. The first thing to understand is that gladiatorial combat was not primarily about killing. This is the misconception that distorts almost everything else about how people think about the games. The Roman arena was expensive to operate. Producing a gladiatorial munis, a public games event, required paying the editor, the person sponsoring the event, enormous sums for the right to use the arena, for the animals, for the staffing, and most significantly for the gladiators themselves. A top-tier gladiator represented years of training investment and a proven track record of entertaining fights. Killing him in every bout would have been economically catastrophic. The standard structure of a gladiatorial bout was not a fight to the death. It was a fight to a decision. Two fighters entered the arena. They fought until one was clearly defeated, too injured to continue effectively, knocked down, disarmed, exhausted, or simply overwhelmed. At that point, the losing fighter could appeal for mercy. He would drop his weapon or shield, raise a finger, the digitus infestus, the appeal gesture, and turn toward the editor or toward the crowd. The decision of whether he lived or died then belonged to the editor. If the sponsor of the games. A politician putting on games to curry public favor would be watching the crowd carefully at this moment. If the crowd was enthusiastic, if they were waving handkerchiefs, shouting, signaling that they wanted mercy, the editor would almost certainly grant it. Killing a popular fighter against the crowd's wishes was bad politics. If the crowd was angry, if the fighter had performed poorly, had shown cowardice, had failed to entertain in the gesture for death, uvula, the thumbs down or the thumb pressed to the chest, would determine the outcome. The fighter's life, in that moment, depended on how entertaining he had been. This is the horror that sits at the center of the gladiatorial system. Not random violence. Not senseless killing. A perfectly calibrated system in which your survival was directly linked to your performance quality. Fight well enough to please the crowd, and you lived. Fight in a way that disappointed them, and the editor had every incentive to let them have what they wanted. You were not just fighting your opponent. You were performing for 50,000 people who held your life in their hands. The missio, the granting of mercy, was not guaranteed even for excellent fighters. There were bouts that were designated sine missione, without mercy. No appeal. No crowd decision. The loser died regardless. These were rarer and considered more spectacular precisely because of their finality. They were saved for special occasions, for particularly significant games, for political moments when the editor wanted to signal something about power and abundance and the spectacular generosity of Rome. And there were fighters who had earned the right to refuse missio entirely. To fight to the death rather than appeal. This was considered the height of gladiatorial honor. To die on your feet, fighting, rather than to kneel and beg for your life from a crowd. The term for this was stans midi, to be sent away standing. A fighter who died this way was celebrated. His name was remembered. The crowd that watched him die would talk about it for years. Rome had a genius for converting suffering into spectacle and then converting spectacle into honor. The man who suffered most completely and most beautifully was the man most worth remembering. The Auctoramentum had created a system in which dying well was a career achievement. Now let us talk about the people who signed it. Because they were not monsters or victims or cardboard figures. They were human beings making decisions under pressure, within constraints, with a range of motivations that is more recognizable than Rome's admirers like to admit. The vast majority of gladiators, perhaps 70 to 80%, based on historical evidence, were slaves or prisoners of war who had no choice in the matter. They did not sign the Auctoramentum. They were simply assigned to the ludus by whoever owned them. The contract did not apply to them because they had no legal personhood to contract with. But a significant minority, perhaps 20 to 30%, were volunteers. Free men who signed the Auctoramentum of their own will. Who were they? Some were the desperate poor. Men who had lost everything: farms, businesses, families, social position, and for whom the ludus represented the only available guarantee of food and shelter. The Roman social safety net was limited and unreliable. The ludus offered stability of a brutal but real kind. You would eat. You would have a roof. You would have medical care. The price was your freedom and your life. But if the alternative was slow starvation in a tenement, the price looked different. Some were thrill seekers. Men, and occasionally women, though female gladiators were rare and considered scandalous, who were drawn to the violence and the danger and the crowd and the strange intoxicating celebrity of the arena. We have evidence of men from relatively comfortable backgrounds who signed the auctoramentum not from necessity but from desire. From a craving for the specific kind of intensity that only the arena provided. Some were social outcasts. Men who had been disgraced by debt, by criminal conviction, by family scandal, and for whom infamia was already effectively present in their lives. Becoming formally infamous by signing the contract cost them nothing in social terms because they had already lost what the contract would have taken. And some, a smaller number but a real one, were experienced fighters from previous conflicts. Former soldiers, former slaves who had been trained in combat, men who possessed skills that had value in the arena and who recognized that value and chose to monetize it while they still could. All of these people signed the same contract. Agreed to the same terms. Uri, vinciri, verberari, feroce necari. Their reasons were different. Their fates were often the same. Let us talk about Spartacus. Because no discussion of the gladiatorial system is complete without him. And because his story illuminates the contract from the inside in a way that nothing else does. Spartacus was a Thracian. A warrior from the region that is now Bulgaria, captured during Rome's wars of expansion in the Balkans, enslaved, and eventually sent to the Ludus at Capua, one of the most famous gladiatorial schools outside of Rome itself, around 73 BCE. He did not sign the auctoramentum. He was a slave. The contract did not extend to him. But he trained within the same system, under the same conditions, subject to the same rules and punishments and rhythms of life that the contract bound others to. And in 73 BC, he led approximately 70 other gladiators in an escape from the Capua Ludus using kitchen implements as weapons. The gladiators' actual weapons were locked away, available only for training and fighting, not available to the fighters themselves in their living quarters. They fled to Mount Vesuvius. Other slaves and desperate free people joined them. Within months their numbers had swelled to thousands. Within a year, to tens of thousands. At their peak, Spartacus commanded an army estimated at anywhere between 70,000 and 120,000 people. The precise numbers are disputed, but the scale is not. For 2 years, this army of the dispossessed defeated multiple Roman military forces. Defeated consular armies. Killed praetors and their legions. Moved across the Italian peninsula largely at will. The Third Servile War, the war Spartacus led, was the most serious internal military threat Rome faced between the Punic Wars and the collapse of the Republic. It shook the foundations of the slave economy that Rome depended on. It terrified the senatorial class in ways that left permanent marks on Roman policy and Roman law. It was eventually crushed. In 71 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, who would later form the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey, suppressed the rebellion with 6 legions. Spartacus died in battle. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Capua to Rome, one cross every 30 meters for 120 miles. Rome wanted everyone who traveled that road to understand what happened to people who challenged the system. But here is what Spartacus's story really tells us about the auctoramentum and the system that produced it. The gladiatorial ludus was not just a place that produced entertainment. It was a place that concentrated, trained, and housed a significant number of physically capable, combat-experienced, potentially dangerous people whose relationship to Roman society was one of enforced submission. The Romans knew this. They were not naive about it. The weapons lockup, the architectural design of the ludi, increasingly enclosed, increasingly controlled as Rome's experience with gladiatorial uprisings accumulated, the monitoring of fighter populations, the careful management of fighter psychology, all of this was part of how Rome managed the risk it had created. You took a dangerous man. You made him more dangerous. You gave him enough food and care to keep him functional. And then you surrounded him with walls and guards and the legal weight of the auctoramentum and hoped that the combination of constraint and incentive was enough to keep the system stable. For the most part, it was. Spartacus was the exception, not the rule. Most gladiators did not rebel. Most lived within the terms of the contract, fought their bouts, accumulated their winnings, and either died or, if they were lucky and skilled and the crowd was merciful, eventually earned their freedom. The freedom. Let us talk about that. Because the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized a gladiator's release from service, was the endpoint that the auctoramentum pointed toward. Even in a document about submission and death, there was an exit. A gladiator who had served their contracted term, or who had performed with sufficient distinction that the editor or the emperor chose to grant early release, received the rudis. A symbolic wooden training sword, presented publicly, before the crowd. It meant, you are done. Your obligation is fulfilled. You are free. The infamia attached by the auctoramentum did not fully lift with the rudis. You had been infamous, and that mark persisted in Roman social memory even after legal release. But you were no longer bound. No longer property. No longer subject to the 4 terrible terms of the contract. Some fighters received the rudis and retired immediately. Bought a small farm or a shop or a tavern with their accumulated winnings and prize money and lived quietly for whatever years remained to them. The physical damage of a gladiatorial career was substantial. Skeletal analysis of gladiatorial remains shows consistent patterns of healed fractures, degenerative joint disease, and traumatic injury that accumulated over fighting careers. Men who survived 10 or 15 years of regular arena combat were physically old by 40. Their bodies had been used hard and showed it. Others received the rudis and went back. Voluntarily. This is perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of the entire gladiatorial system. Men who had earned their freedom, who had survived, who had paid the price, who chose to sign a new auctoramentum and return to the arena. Why? The money was part of it. Experienced fighters with established reputations could command substantial fees for bouts. Apollos Primus, a first-rank gladiator, could earn enough in a single fight to represent years of income for an ordinary Roman worker. But money does not fully explain it. Some of these men were not poor. Some of them had accumulated enough in their first careers to live comfortably. They went back anyway. The arena does something to people. The intensity of it. The absolute clarity of it. The feeling of being alive in a way that nothing else produces. Modern combat veterans write about this, the difficulty of returning to ordinary life after experiencing the heightened reality of combat. The way that regular existence can feel thin, muted, insufficiently real after you have lived at the extreme edge of survival. The gladiators who returned to the arena were not necessarily addicted to violence. Some of them, perhaps, were addicted to being fully alive. Rome had created, with its terrible contract, a system that gave people an experience of intense aliveness and then released them back into ordinary existence. And some of them could not bear it. The auctoramentum was a cage. But it was a cage that contained something that felt, to the people inside it, like freedom. Now let us zoom out and look at the full legal architecture of the gladiatorial system. Because it was more sophisticated than a single contract. The auctoramentum was the foundation. But on top of it, Rome built an entire body of law that governed every aspect of gladiatorial life and death. There were regulations governing the conditions under which an editor could call for a fighter's death. There were rules, not always followed, but legally present, about minimum rest periods between bouts for experienced fighters. There were legal provisions governing what happened to a gladiator's property and earnings if he died, including protections for fighters who had families, which many did, despite the infamia, that ensured their savings could be passed to their children. There were specific laws governing the lanista's obligations. He was legally required to provide adequate food. The specific dietary standards were documented. He was legally required to provide medical care. He was legally required to pay the contracted fee to fighters who completed their agreed terms. If a lanista violated these obligations, a gladiator, even one who had signed the auctoramentum, even one who had surrendered most of his legal rights, retained certain minimal protections under Roman law. He could bring a legal complaint. He could, in theory, seek redress through the courts. Whether those theoretical protections were practically available to a man held in a ludus with no money, no social connections, and a legal status of infamia is another question. The gap between the law on paper and the law in practice is a constant feature of Roman legal history. But the framework existed. Rome was not running the gladiatorial system as pure lawless exploitation. It was running it as lawful, legally documented, bureaucratically administered exploitation. The distinction matters. It tells you something about how Rome thought about power and legitimacy and the relationship between them. Rome believed that the right piece of paper, properly witnessed and sealed, could make almost anything acceptable. Not just legally acceptable, morally acceptable. If you signed, you consented. If you consented, there was nothing to answer for.
Again.
The Auctoramentum was, among other things, Rome's ethical alibi for the arena. Let us talk about the women. Because they existed, and history has mostly looked away from them. Female gladiators, called gladiatrices by modern historians, though the Romans used various terms, appear in historical sources, in art, and in archaeological evidence. They were rare. They were considered scandalous in a way that male gladiatorial combat was not. And they operated within the same contractual framework as male fighters. The evidence is fragmentary but consistent. A relief sculpture found in Halicarnassus shows two female fighters named Amazon and Achillea in combat. Both are armed in the style of the provocator fighting type. Both are shown standing after a bout, having apparently both fought to a draw and both been granted the missio. Both names are combat names, the kind of dramatic pseudonyms that gladiators commonly adopted. Literary sources mention female fighters with a mixture of titillation and moral outrage. Juvenal, the satirist, writes with heavy sarcasm about women training in weapons, wrapping themselves in armor, fighting in the arena, doing things that no respectable Roman woman should do. Domitian, the emperor who built the Ludus Magnus, is recorded as staging bouts in which female fighters faced male opponents, and bouts in which female fighters faced dwarfs. This was apparently considered spectacular even by Roman standards, which suggests that the regular gladiatorial games had enough of a baseline of the extraordinary that escalation required unusual combinations. The women who fought in the arena had signed the same contract as the men. The same four terms. The same submission to the Lanista's authority. The same infamia. The same dependency on crowd approval for their survival. They had done this in a society that considered respectable femininity to consist of domestic virtue, physical modesty, and complete disengagement from public violence. To sign the Auctoramentum as a woman was not just to surrender legal rights. It was to declare, publicly and permanently, that you stood outside the entire framework of Roman female respectability. Whatever drove them to it, desperation, desire, the same calculation of risk and reward that drove male volunteers, they paid a social price that their male counterparts, already infamous by the contract, did not have to pay in quite the same way. Rome's legal system was comprehensive enough to include them. Its social system was cruel enough to punish them additionally for being included. Now let us put the Auctoramentum in historical context. Because it did not exist in isolation. It was part of a much larger Roman system of legal self-surrender that tells you something fundamental about how Roman society was structured. The Romans had other mechanisms by which free people could place themselves under another person's authority. The institution of nexum, debt bondage, had existed in Rome's earliest periods, allowing a debtor to surrender their labor and freedom to a creditor until the debt was paid. It was so widely abused that it was eventually restricted, though not eliminated. The institution of clientela patronage created complex networks of obligation and dependence in which free people of lower status submitted themselves to the protection and authority of wealthy patrons in exchange for financial and social support. The obligations of a cliens to his patronus were real and binding, though less extreme than the Auctoramentum. The institution of locatio conductio operarum labor contracts allowed free people to sell their labor for specific periods in arrangements that could be quite restrictive. The Auctoramentum sat at the most extreme end of this spectrum of voluntary submission. It was what you signed when other options had failed or never existed. When the ordinary mechanisms of survival had closed their doors on you. In this sense, The contract was not an aberration in Roman society. It was the logical endpoint of a society in which vast inequality combined with extensive legal frameworks for the documentation of submission. Rome had spent centuries developing sophisticated legal machinery for organizing human beings in hierarchies of power and dependence. The auctoramentum was simply the most honest version of what that machinery could produce. Most Roman power relationships were somewhat obscured by the language of mutual benefit and social obligation. The auctoramentum dispensed with the obscuring. It said clearly, in plain Latin, with witnesses, here are the terms. You will be burned. You will be chained. You will be beaten. You may be killed. You agree to all of this. The clarity was almost admirable. Rome was usually better at hiding what it was. Compare the gladiatorial contract to the employment contracts of the Industrial Revolution. Not because they are identical, they are not, but because the comparison reveals something. The factory worker in Manchester in 1840 did not sign a document agreeing to be burned, chained, beaten, and killed. But the conditions of factory work in that period included all of these things as practical realities. Children burned in factory fires because safety requirements did not exist. Workers were bound to their employment by truck systems that paid them in company scrip redeemable only at company stores. Workers were beaten, effectively, by the pace of work, by the systematic destruction of their health, by the absolute power differential between employer and employee in a system that offered no alternatives. They died. In large numbers. From industrial accidents that were preventable. From occupational diseases that were understood but ignored. From exhaustion and malnutrition and the long accumulated damage of decades of brutal physical labor. And they signed employment contracts to do this. Voluntarily. Because the alternative was destitution. The Roman auctoramentum at least had the honesty to name what it was. The industrial employment contract wrapped the same essential transaction, your body and your life in exchange for survival, in the language of voluntary commerce and economic freedom. Which is more honest? The contract that says you may be killed? Or the contract that says you will work in this factory, in these conditions, for this wage, and does not mention the life expectancy statistics? Seneca would have an answer. He would say they are the same thing. The willing surrender of your time and your body and the most productive years of your life to someone else's purposes, in exchange for survival, is the structure of an unfree existence regardless of what the document calls it. The auctoramentum just had the courage of its own ugliness. There is one more thing the contract contained that historians rarely discuss. And it is perhaps the most psychologically revealing clause of all. The auctoramentum required fighters to swear an oath. Not just to sign. To swear. Before witnesses. Invoking the gods. The oath used language that, even translated into English 2,000 years later, carries a weight that is difficult to shake. The gladiator swore to endure Uri, Vinciri, Verberari, Feroce Necari, to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by iron, and to do so patiently. Without complaint. Without resistance. With acceptance. The oath transformed the contract from a commercial transaction into a sacred obligation. You were not just legally bound. You were morally bound. Cosmically bound. The gods were witnesses to your submission. This was not accidental. The Romans understood that legal obligation and social pressure and financial incentive could all fail under sufficient stress. A man facing death in an arena, in the moment of maximum terror, might find that a contract felt abstract and distant. The oath was designed to be different. The oath was internal. It lived in you. It was part of your identity as a fighter. The gladiatorial oath was also, historians believe, the model for one of the most important oaths in Roman military history, the sacramentum taken by Roman soldiers when they enlisted. The military oath borrowed its structure and its terminology from the gladiatorial oath. Roman soldiers, like gladiators, swore to accept the complete authority of their commanders, to endure whatever was required, to submit to punishment without resistance. The most formidable military machine in the ancient world built its sworn obligation on the same foundation as the arena, which tells you something about Rome's understanding of human psychology. That the willingness to submit completely, to place yourself, your body, your life in someone else's hands, was not just a legal formality. It was a transformation. An identity. A way of being human that Rome had studied carefully and learned to construct deliberately. The oath was the final clause of the contract. The one that could not be voided by legal argument or changed circumstances. The one that lived inside you, long after the stylus was put down and the wax was sealed. So who was right about the gladiators? The Romans who celebrated them, who wrote their names on walls, who threw jewelry into the arena, who packed 50,000 people into the Colosseum to watch them fight, they saw warriors. They saw men who had chosen the most extreme version of the human experience available to them and had the courage to live inside it. The Roman philosophers who were uncomfortable with the games, Seneca, who attended once and left disturbed, who wrote that watching men die made him less human, they saw something else. They saw a society feeding its appetites on human suffering and calling it entertainment. They saw a moral corruption that spread from the arena into the broader culture, normalizing violence, diminishing empathy, training a population to find pleasure in watching people hurt each other. Both were seeing the same thing. From different angles. The Octoramentum created a system that was, simultaneously, a genuine expression of extreme human capability and a profound institutional cruelty. The men who signed it were, simultaneously, agents of their own choices and victims of a social structure that left them few other choices. The crowds that watched were, simultaneously, enthusiastic participants in a shared cultural experience and willing consumers of institutionalized suffering. Rome's genius was always this: the ability to make complicated, morally compromised things feel coherent and inevitable. To create systems so total, so thoroughly documented, so deeply integrated into daily life and cultural identity that questioning them felt not like moral clarity but like social deviance. The Octoramentum worked not just because it was legally binding. It worked because Rome had built a world in which it seemed reasonable. In which a free man could look at a contract that promised him burning and beating and death and think, yes, this is a reasonable transaction. In which a crowd of 50,000 people could watch another human being fight for their life and feel, not horror, but entertainment. Systems do not require evil people to produce terrible outcomes. They require ordinary people operating within frameworks that have normalized the terrible. The last gladiatorial games in Rome were held in 404 AD, according to traditional accounts. A Christian monk named Telemachus or Almachius, depending on the source, entered the arena during a bout and attempted to separate the fighters. He was killed by the crowd. The Emperor Honorius, reportedly moved by his death, banned gladiatorial combat shortly after. The games had lasted, in some form, for nearly 700 years. 700 years of the Octoramentum. 700 years of men signing their names to burning, binding, beating, and death. The last fighters to sign it are unnamed in history. We do not know who they were, what drove them to the contract, whether they survived, whether they earned the rudis or died on the sand. They are gone. Their contracts dissolved. Their oaths ended. But the question the contract asks, the question that every version of this transaction asks, in every era, in every form, that question is still here. What are you willing to sign away? What would you exchange for survival? For money? For the feeling of being alive? How much of yourself would you surrender to a contract, to an employer, to a system, to a culture, before you looked up from the document and asked who was holding the stylus?